Hello, tabletop wargamers, and welcome to Tried and True, a podcast hosted by the Delaware War Machine community. Join us as we dive deep into topics around our favorite games, exploring methods and techniques proven to enhance anyone's gaming experience. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 11th episode of Tried and True. I am your host, Paul.
I'm Andy.
Andy, this is the first episode that you and I are doing together.
Is it? I know I've been on some group stuff before, right?
No, but I mean, like, it's just literally just you and I for the first time.
Oh, okay. Well, happy birthday.
Thank you. I love it. Thank you for joining us in the third episode of the Deep Dive into Privateer Press series. This has been a really amazing project. We're really happy with how it's going. We're finding that a lot of people are giving comments and kudos. They're really happy to see what's going on behind the curtains of Privateer Press. We want to take a moment to go ahead and thank More Than Dice for giving us a platform to share the good news. If you like listening to us, we ask you to go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We still have that Frozen Forge raffle that we're going to be doing. We're looking to get up to 500 subs, so you can go ahead and check us out. If you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, you'll be able to see all the battle reports, the podcast, all the good stuff. And, you know, you give us your comments, your likes. The YouTube algorithm says, hey, this is pretty cool stuff, and pushes it out to other people who like War Machine and other miniature tabletop war games. We want to also take a moment to thank our patrons on Patreon for helping us out with being able to do all those battle reports. And if you didn't know, you can go ahead and join us on Patreon, support the cause. And hey, when you're on the Patreon, you'll be able to go ahead and take a look at the artwork. You get early releases of all the stuff, and you'd be able to join up on our Discord, be in our little like private chat, talk to all the different people that are on Tried and True, and it's a great time.
Please help us be less in the red.
Please help. But at this time, we're going to go ahead and introduce our third guest, Doug Hamilton. Doug Hamilton is the digital sculptor over at Privateer Press. So, Doug, go ahead and take a moment and say hello to all your fans out there.
Hello. It's good to talk to everybody again. It's been a little while since I've got to participate in any podcasts, so it's always nice to get back in touch with the community, especially with convention season right in the middle of us right now.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. And I have to say, when I first started to talk with you, I saw all the St. Louis Blues things. I'm like, oh man, this is a guy I can definitely hang out with.
Yes, love me or hate me, I always support my team.
I think my wife Erica was showing me something else you sculpted. It was like a beer tap thing.
Yeah, actually I did that with another War Machine player, Chris Johnson, who does Mechanica Studios. He had reached out to me last year to work on a project for Anheuser-Busch and the Kansas City Chiefs, which was a Travis Kelce bobblehead beer tap going to like 700 bars in the Kansas City area. So it was a fun project to work on, something different. And you know, anytime I can show a project like that with the NFL and that's feather in the cap.
Yeah, that's really cool. I thought it was just an at-home hobby kind of thing, but that's awesome that it's actually going to be used out there.
Yeah, it's out there somewhere. I haven't seen it because I don't live close enough to Kansas City, but I know they're out there in the wild.
His brother is Eagles center and sort of a local hero here as well, so they're famous everywhere.
That's right. I remember that.
And did you end up like celebrating back in 2019 when they won the Stanley Cup?
When the Blues won the Cup, absolutely. What's funny is the night the Blues won the Cup, I had to fly to Seattle the very next morning for lock and load. So I left out at like 5 a.m. and I was decked out in all my gear, and you know, it was kind of cool because we got up there and everybody was excited in Seattle because they knew they had their team coming in a couple of years, and everybody was super cool about congratulating us and, you know, great job and great victory. One of the restaurants I went to, one of the bigger seafood places up there, the manager was all excited for hockey to come into Seattle, and so when we got our check, all our appetizers had been comped, and it was great. I had a good time.
It's like you're real people famous or something.
Well, that was just because they were being nice, because we chatted about hockey for like 30 minutes waiting for our table.
I love it. Well, hey, Doug, what we want to do on this episode is, you know, really kind of get a deep dive into what your role is over at Privateer Press and, you know, how you ended up getting started and everything. So if you're all right, I wanted to start off, you know, we were talking on the side, right? We're talking hockey, but, you know, you mentioned, like, how did you end up getting into digital sculpting? Like, was it just something like a hobby that you picked up, or did you go to a school for it? Like how did you end up getting to where you are now?
I went to school. I have a degree in digital animation, and I started on that in 2007. And I'd always been into games. I've been into games since the early 80s when I picked up the Red Box Dungeons and Dragons second edition. I think it was second edition. It's been a long time. but I was always into the games and the miniatures and things like that. So in 2007, at age 37, I decided to make a career change and went back to school. Got a bachelor's in digital animation, but about halfway through, I suspected that sculpting was going to switch to digital, and I had picked up some software and started to learn that, thinking that maybe I'm catching on to this ahead of time before it actually happens, because 3D printers weren't really good enough. There were a few super high end that could make miniature quality, but I started learning that software, and I always wanted to work on games and miniatures. So it just kind of happened.
And then how about you actually getting your job at Privateer Press? Because you mentioned that you were waiting in line for Retribution Colossal. Was it Hyperion or Helios was the one you were looking for?
It was Hyperion. Hyperion was the first one, right?
I honestly don't know.
Hyperion was the first one. So
come on, Ret Player.
I don't know my history of like model release.
Well, and I don't always remember names, because sometimes the names change before releases, or I'll get it and it's just got something generic or a placeholder. So, but it was Hyperion. So I went to Gen Con that year that Hyperion was releasing, and I had stayed up late working on my portfolio because I wanted to show it off. I think I had graduated earlier that year, and I was trying to find a job, and I'd done a couple of very small miniature jobs for companies that I don't know if they ever even put anything out. But I had worked on my portfolio, and I was working on it that Wednesday night before I went to Gen Con. And this was before you carried your portfolio around on an iPad. You actually carried it around, in like a folder and such. So I was looking for a place to print it, and of course couldn't find any place to print it. So I went to Gen Con with just some business cards and no portfolio. So while I was at Gen Con, I was in line with some press ganger friends of mine from Louisiana, and we're in this 2.5 hour line, and Matt Wilson comes by a couple different times to BS with people in line, and he's talking to my buddies because they're press gangers, and my buddies are like, "Oh, you should see his art, he's really good." And Matt's like, "Yeah, but he doesn't have anything to show me." So I was like, man, I really missed my opportunity here. 2 different times Matt came by, and I didn't have anything to show him. So I wait in line, I get up there, I get my Hyperion, I pick up a few other things for other friends, and I just like, well, next time I'll be smarter. But I did go around that day and hand out cards to smaller companies. I don't even remember everyone I spoke to, but somehow one of my cards got to Mike McVeigh, who's one of the early Privateer guys, and he was working on a project called Sedition Wars, which was one of the early successful Kickstarters. And he had reached out to do some sculpts for that project, some organic alien creature things. So he reached out, I don't know, a month or so, 2 months afterwards. And I wasn't overly familiar with him. And I had mentioned it to some friends who were like, "Oh yeah, he's that's a name in the industry. People know who he is. So that's cool that you got that kind of contact." So I did that. I started working on those projects for him. While I was working on those projects, we started to get into the fall, and Warfare Weekend, well, it was War Machine Weekend at that time. War Machine Weekend was coming up, and the day before that show, it was the Wednesday before War Machine Weekend was supposed to start, and Privateer put an ad out for a digital sculpture, and I happened to have taken that Thursday and Friday off. I wasn't planning on going to War Machine Weekend because I wasn't a big War Machine player at the time, and I happened to have that Thursday and Friday off. I reached out to one of my buddies here, Tim Simpson, who does some freelance writing for us. He's always been a big supporter of War Machine, and he was friends with DC, who was doing rules for Privateer at that time, and also from St. Louis. And so I asked if he could reach out and see if maybe they'd give me an interview that weekend, which he did. And then Privateer told him that they'd give me a few minutes. And so they wanted me to come by on Friday morning before the show started. And so that's when I did. That Thursday, I got my portfolio together, got everything tidied up, got my resume updated and put in there. So I went to War Machine Weekend that Friday morning. And it was one of the rare shows where Ron Cruzy went to the show. He's our studio director, and really he doesn't go to that many shows. So he went to this one, and I met him first, and he glanced through my portfolio, and within about 5 minutes he asked how I felt about moving to Seattle. So it was off to a good start. And then I thought he was going to blow me off, and because he's like, "I'm going to walk outside for a minute." I was like, "All right, well, I mean, that went good, but I'm going to, I guess I'll just hang out in here." And he's like, "You want to come outside and hang out?" So we went out there. We found out we had a lot of common interests, like World War II and World War II games and historicals and things like that. So we hit it off great right away. And Ron told me just hang out a little bit. He had to go into the hall and see some people, and socialize and all that. In a bit, Ed Burrell, the creative director at the time, was going to come down, and he goes, I'll have Ed talk to you also. So Ed came down. We're sitting in the middle of the lobby of War Machine Weekend, and everybody's milling about and walking around, and Ed checks out my portfolio, and right away he kind of had a nice smile, and he was like, well, let's give him a freelance project. So they gave me the zombie from Zombies Keep Out.
Oh my God, I love that game so much.
Yeah, it's a really great game. So I did that zombie, and there were no issues with it. And it was around Thanksgiving at this point. And the college that I was teaching at, that I actually attended, I was working on my master's in education at that time as a backup plan. And they were having some issues and started laying people off based on how long they had been there. Well, I'd only been teaching there for like a year and a half. So eventually my name came up and I got laid off in between my first and second interview. Well, the second interview, Ron assured me, he's like, I got you for a second. You're my guy. Just hang in there. And we're trying to get everybody back from holiday. And so everybody comes back. They do the second interview. It was a bit of a, you could just tell that it was kind of thrown together kind of thing, that he had already made up his mind. And so they did the background check and everything came back clean. And a week or so later, I got my offer. And on the 1st of January, 2013, I was driving to Seattle.
Next thing you know, you're moving, huh?
Yes, exactly. I literally packed up my car, threw my dog, my junk in. My wife at the time and my kid came up, a few months later after we made sure that they weren't going to send me packing and were going to keep me. So,
well, as one of the, I guess the more senior people working at Privateer Press at this point, I know a lot of us really want to know a lot more nitty gritty stuff about like, how do they go from like concept art to, design of a model to redesign, the iteration of all that? I know it probably varies a lot from model to model, but can you give us like a vague iterative process, I guess?
For me, it's about the same every time. Somebody has to come up with an idea. Somebody has to come up with some art. And until that's all done, I don't know anything. So if they have a faction they're working on, they'll come up with some kind of brief about what the character is going to look like. It might be something like, it's a warjack with an axe in the right hand and an open left hand or something like that. Because the devs aren't really worried about what it looks like. That's not their side of things. They're just making something that's like, okay, well, we know they want a warjack and it's going to be a PS19 axe and a PS13 fist or something like that. They're going to have it. It's all just written down. Well, they'll pass it over to the art department then, and we'll start working on concepts for it. And we work with several different concept artists. Andrea is probably he's our staff artist, and he's one of the best I've ever seen. So I like to say that Andrea gets to do almost everything, and Andrea will work up the concept, send in multiple versions of it, and then Matt and a few others will decide which version of that concept they want to use, what poses they want to use, and then they'll pass it along to sculpting, to myself. Usually it goes through Ron first. Sometimes he'll look at it and they might talk about some production related issues or potential issues that we might need to change a few things. Or even once the art comes to me, Ron and I might talk about what could cause a problem or what we should do differently or what we should do to help production. Because what happens with the concept artists, a lot of times the concept artist really doesn't think about the sculpt itself. So we'll get artists that see an open space and they're like, well, we'll put a squiggly line in here. And I don't know how to sculpt squiggly lines because it, it just doesn't register. But or we like a lot of detail. We like huge shoulder pads and we like layers upon layers of armor and cloth and armor and then more cloth. And there's only so much you can put on a 35 millimeter model. So at some point when there's 7 layers of armor, somebody has to decide that we need to make it 4 or 5. And that's usually what I do is when it comes to me, I'll kind of cut back on how much extra stuff is on there. And also when it comes to a pose, they'll send over a suggested pose. And sometimes the shoulder pads are so big and the pose doesn't really take into account things like shoulder pads. So they'll have the arms up over their head, in this dramatic sword swinging pose. And if you did that with some of our shoulder pads, the crush their skulls. So
Hey Doug, can I actually ask, when you're developing the models and you're actually doing the poses and stuff, is it like you make and I only know like video game character rigging and stuff, is it like you make like a T-pose model and then you rig it, or do you actually sculpt it in the pose that it's supposed to be in?
that I don't have a set way of doing it. So I don't rig any of the models. Rigging is, even when I did animation, rigging was just a pain. So
It's a totally different skill set.
It is, and it's a skill set I have. It's just not worth the effort in ZBrush for a model that's never going to move. So usually what I do is, if I'm comfortable with the model, if it's a faction I've done it a lot of times and I know there's not going to be a lot of corrections on it, I'll just sculpt it in the pose. Now that doesn't mean that I don't have like a T pose set up that I'll build armor on it. So I might take that T pose, whatever template I use, or mannequin that I use. I might have the T pose set up, and then I might use that same mannequin and rough in a pose, so I just know how it's going to look. And then I build the armor, or I build the helmet or the head on that mannequin, and then I just grab it and move it over to my pose model. It's almost like the only thing I can compare it to is like dressing a doll or a paper doll or something like that, where you just put on different. I don't know if remember that from kids, where there would be like books. You'd have like a posed picture and they could put different clothes on it or hats or whatever. Anyway, I treat it almost like it's a mannequin, and I might sculpt the chest plate on the T-pose mannequin, but then I immediately move it over to my action pose, and that way the scale stays right. And especially if it's something that's symmetrical, like if I was doing a retribution armor that has etching, or like the little power etching on each side of the forearm, and it's symmetrical. Well, I'll leave it symmetrical until I put that detail in there, and then I'll move it to my pose model.
Gotcha.
You may not be following me on this.
No, I mean, like, I know, like, at least, like, for, like, retribution models, they have, like, I don't know what they're called, but the little tiny, like, spheres, and then they have, like, when you're saying the etchings, are like the swirly bits that go around with, like, the little tiny...
Like the channels that are cut in, the lines, I don't know what to call them either.
Etching sounds good.
Yeah, I like etching. And you were saying with these models, with the design process, because Andy absolutely loves sticking models together, right? It's your favorite thing.
I glue my fingers together regularly.
When you put these models together, right? Who makes the decision of, we're going to set, like, the arm will fit into the shoulder, or like the top of the chest will fit into the legs? Like, how does that engineering work? Is that your responsibility, or is that physical manufacturing?
So when I build a model, I try to keep in mind that someone has to engineer this model. And my first couple of years at Privateer, I did a lot of the engineering because we were new to digital sculpting and nobody really knew how to do it. So they figured totally didn't. I figured it out as I went. But now we have dedicated people that do engineering. Right now, Stu, he does most of the engineering, and he's done a great job. He's been doing it for several years now. And by passing a model off to him, I don't have to stop and engineer, because engineering is time consuming, and he's on site, so he can go to production and they can discuss how they want to break something down. For the most part, I'm eliminated from that. But what I do is I try to build a model where it's easy for them to manipulate if they need to. If they need to move an arm around or change a shoulder pad, I try to work in a lot of layers where it's easy for them to move those things around if they need to, or cut something out completely. Or what happens is I send the files from here up to HQ. They'll look at it with production, and then production will tell them, all right, this is how we want to lay this out. This is going to work. This isn't going to work. This is never going to work. So we have to change something. Yeah. And that happens. And so they'll go back and forth and figure it out. They'll do test prints. But the studio, actually, HQ decides how they're going to connect, what the connection point is going to look like. Sometimes I mean, there might be significant changes. Usually there aren't, but they may have to change something dramatically or change a pose completely, and whatever's going to make it work better for production.
I know everybody has models they like, they think work perfectly, and models that, they despise putting together. Do you have any nightmares to share? Like any specific models that came out in the past couple of years or so that it was really tough to get right?
Or is there even like a faction? Because you said you're the digital sculptor, you do all the sculpts. Is there any factions that's just been difficult?
Well, first I'll clarify. I don't do all of the sculpts. We have a handful of freelancers that do work for us. There's way too many sculpts for me to do by myself. So I just happen to be a staff employee, which means they can send it back and forth to me as many times as they want, and I can't really say anything or complain because they send me a check every 2 weeks. But as far as is there in recent years things that I've had some issues with? Yeah, there actually is. So I'm coming up on 10 years with Privateer. I've done hundreds of models at this point, and the only time I've ever had a project pulled from me where they had somebody else help out with it was working on the Eternus Continuum for Warcaster.
Mm.
Is that the black and red faction?
Yeah, exactly. So their Jack, it might be a Marauder. It was so I've built War Machine Jacks for so long that I just assumed that it would be the same, where it was a little more squat and a little more bulky. And these Jacks aren't. They're more like a light Jack. They're a little bit
Sleek.
Yeah, sleek, exactly. They're a little more sleek, and Ron and I just could not come to happy grounds on this one. He saw it different than me. I saw it different than him. And we went back and forth. And finally he was like, I'm going to have somebody else finish this off, because it got to a point where we were just spending too much time on it. And I think if we were sitting in the same room like we used to, where we could, I could move something around and he could sit there and go, yeah, that's it. That's what I want. I think we could have knocked it out in 5 or 10 minutes, but going back and forth with email and files and the way we work now, we just couldn't agree on anything. So,
you know what that reminds me of, or what it sounds like, because it reminds me of, like, my relationship with my tattoo artist. It's like the same thing where, like, I'm emailing him back and forth and we're trying to get the art just right. There's so much information that's lost in the communication. But then when I'm actually with him before he puts the stencil on me, I'm like, can you do this, do this, do this? And he actually understands what I mean. Like, it's amazing how much of a difference it is just to be in the same room with someone.
Yeah, 100%. And on my side, I guess I'm an art guy, and Ron is, he's an art guy too, but he has to look at it from a more technical standpoint. And his job is to make sure it looks like the concept art, at the end of the day. My job is to make it look like the concept also, but he's the one that gets in trouble for it if it doesn't. He's the one that Wilson's going to come down on if it doesn't look like it's supposed to. So he has to nitpick, and he also has to push us, any of the sculptors, but I know me especially. That last 10% of a sculpt, it's the difference between a good sculpt and a great sculpt. I need that push almost every time, because by the time I'm at that point, I'm just tired of working on that particular model and I want to move on to something new. So he's always done a great job at pushing my buttons, whether it's a good way or a bad way, but always getting the most out of me. So, he and I have had a great relationship, and
sounds like it's a good dynamic then.
It is. It's great. But that model, and then also there was one other model in Eternus Continuum. I don't know what the deal was with me on that stretch, but there were 2 models that I did parts of and somebody else did parts of. And that's the only time I've ever had an issue with models. It's never, in 10 years, I've never had any other projects pulled for me because they didn't like it, and I felt bad because I hate that I didn't hit the level of success that I wanted to, but at the same time, you forget it and move on and do the best you can on the next one.
Aesthetically, I actually really like the squatty, steam jack kind of look. I play Protectorate, so I really like the, slapped together, riveted metal, steel plate kind of thing. Even the Rhett stuff's a little too sleek for me.
I was going to say the Rhett stuff is kind of, if I had to say there was a sweet spot, the Rhett stuff is my sweet spot.
That being said, the new Signar stuff, that's some sexy work. I like I like that Signar light jack a lot.
Yeah, the new Signar stuff looks amazing, and I hate Signar, so
damn swans.
So would you say that Rhett was the faction that was your bread and butter? What made Rhett so good, or was there another faction that was...
The factions that I've done the most of, for Hordes it was Legion, and for War Machine it was Retribution. And really Retribution started right from when I started. The first model I ever did for them, for War Machine, was Aurora 1. I remember walking in the doors my first day of Privateer, and they're like, you know what Convergence of Cirrus is? And I'm like, nope.
Enjoy wings.
They're like, well, look at this piece of art. And it's one of the best concepts I had ever seen at that point. And I figured I was going to get sent back home within my 90 days. But I went ahead and worked on it, and she turned out good. Not great, but good. But right after that, I did the Earthbreaker, and then I think I started on my first Retribution models, which kind of I did almost every Retribution model the last 10 years. I think they had a unit of infantry I didn't do, the rest of us, and there may have been 1 or 2 little things in there. But
did you do Gareth 1?
I did not. He was traditional before I started.
Okay, gotcha. Because I was going to say, like, Gareth 1 was the reason why I ended up picking up the faction. I don't know, just like his pose, just the way that he looked, I'm like, I don't know why, but this model just speaks to me, and that's literally why I picked the faction. Just one guy from that.
Absolutely. And I picked up Retribution myself just because I just like the feel of them. There was something about the look and the feel, and it was just something that clicked with me, and so that's what I went with for my main War Machine faction.
And then for all these different projects that you do, whether if it's like a Warcaster or a Warlock, a Jack, a Beast, a unit, like how long does one of these projects normally go? Like, let's say you get the concept art. We won't worry about all the back and forth unless you want to go talk about like the back and forth. But how long does like a project of creating a model from start to finish like normally take? Is it a few weeks? Is it a month?
Everyone's a little different, and like right now I'm working on a bunch of different projects, so I really couldn't tell you how long it takes because I send something over for review and I work on something else. And then that model comes back and I may go right back to it, or I may wait a couple of days until I send the next project in and then I go back. I don't really know. I've had days where I can knock out a model in one day. I've had times where it takes me 2 weeks to knock out a model. It really varies. It depends on the complexity. It depends on how comfortable I am with that style. There's really no good answer to that question.
No, it's okay. It's all right. And Andy, did you want to ask a question now?
Yeah, I got a little spoilery one. Can you tell us how many 80 millimeter bases you've worked on yet?
0.
Damn it. Okay, well, and then, well, I actually was wondering, because you're like talking about the amount of time for this. I wanted to like ask about a unit, because units have like the same model or relatively close looking model in different poses. Is it annoying to make a unit, or is it fun to like have the different dynamic poses and doing each one of them?
I hate working on units. They're terrible. Historically, if you look at my Privateer Press work, you'll see that I haven't done a lot of units. And I think maybe it's because I just got lucky, or maybe they're tough to work on. I'm working on a unit right now, and I don't know. You have to think about the different pose, and you're reusing some equipment, but some of it has to be different because you don't want to. It's not going to be a clone, and
it's a lot of detail you have to have in a very small space, I guess.
Yeah, and it's tedious. It's just tedious making 3 or 4 or 5 sculpts of the same unit and posing it, and it's just not my favorite. I'd rather. So there's no glory in infantry.
I don't think that's true. I personally, I really love when you have a unit of guys. Like, I love my unit of Idrians. The fact that they have at least 3 or 4 different poses for each one, and they all have, the hodgepodge of stuff that they have on them. And they all have, you can all paint different hair colors and different, different skin tones and stuff on all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I when I say there's no glory, I mean it from an artistic perspective, meaning I would rather do a Warjack or a Warcaster because they're going to be a more prominent part of the army, not that infantry doesn't have its place or anything like that. Just that if I had my choice, I'd rather do a Warjack or a War Beast or a Warcaster.
And then I wanted to ask, though, because you talked about using ZBrush earlier. Have you found a lot of the digital tools, like, because you said the 3D modeling, right, was the future. Have you found like that technology to evolve over time and you've been keeping up with it? Or has ZBrush just been consistently being updated? Like have you used different like programs and stuff, and the reason why I want to ask this is that if you have aspiring artists that are interested in this line of work, like what maybe programs they could play around with, whether it be Blender, ZBrush, or what have you.
Yeah, so for me that's tough for me to answer because I've been working with ZBrush since 2009, I think. And ZBrush is basically the only sculpting software I've used. I went to school and used Maya for animation, but ZBrush is the only sculpting software. I know there's different software out there now, like Blender, for example, but I've never used any of that because I picked up ZBrush. I paid for a full version of it in 2009, and I've never put another penny into it because every update's free and every new version is free, and it's great software. It does everything I need it to, so I don't have to look anywhere else.
Doug, do you actually have like a favorite sculptor artist? Because with how, like, you were talking about like 3D printers earlier, right? And they're becoming a little bit more prominent with resin printers and FDM printers. There's this one Patreon, they're called Archvillain Games, and the sculpts, they make my mouth water just with how much detail they end up showing on there. Do you have a favorite sculptor that you like, or maybe who has inspired you in some of the art that you end up creating?
As far as sculptors go, it's when I first started digitally, there were almost no digital guys. So a few of the traditional guys that were working for like Privateer, whether it was freelance or full time, those guys were a big influence on me. Even though I stepped in to work with them, they had so many years of experience. There are guys like Patrick Keith, who did freelance work for us and has his own line of miniatures and does work for other companies. And I always liked his style. He did some of that early Retribution stuff. And then the employees that my coworkers at the time, a guy like Brian Dugas, who was he's still a great sculptor. He was one of the great traditional sculptors. He did like the Archangel and countless other models for Privateer over the years. He was a great influence. His style was good. He just knew how to do it. Ben Meisner was the first digital sculptor at Privateer, so it was fun working next to another digital sculptor that was kind of figuring things out. And then we also had Michael Jenkins, who he's at one of the competitors now, but that dude was just a phenom how good he was. And so I was older than all of these guys, and I'm also super competitive, so I tried to learn as quick as I could because I just wanted to be as good as I could. And those guys definitely made me learn fast and up my game fast.
So you talked about the sculptor artist, right, and the competitive guys. Is there a model, whether if it's a Privateer Press model or something else, it's all right, they don't have to listen to it. Did you have a favorite sculptor?
Yes, I do. All of mine. No, I I would have to go with the Archangel. I think it's just a masterpiece. It's a centerpiece. It's
on my shelf in my basement. I love it.
Yeah, mine's when I moved from Seattle back to Missouri. I left mine up in Seattle with my buddy Aaron because it's fully painted. It has double giant wings on it, and it wasn't going to survive that trip. So.
Sorry, can I ask about the paint job with it? I looked at it because it's the orange, yellow, the blue. Was it inspired by like the Avatar flying dragon things?
100%. It's a total copy of the Turok Makto or whatever it was.
I looked at that. I'm like, I know I've seen this. Did you wet blend it or was that airbrush?
It's all hand.
Oh my gosh, that is beautiful blending in that. I could have sworn that was airbrush.
Yeah, I guess it's one of the better paint jobs I've done because I've had a few people ask, about airbrushing, and I was like, nope, not airbrush, just patience.
And then Doug, a lot of us have been playing from all sorts of different times. We like Mark 1, Mark 2, what have you. And some of the models are really old. And I think back to the old brigands, like the Pharaoh brigands. They're all hunched over with their big old guns, and they look like they're just trudging forward. And then I go take a look at the new brigands where they're in like dynamic poses and stuff. It's like the same with the Signar Arcane Tempest gun mages. When does PP decide to redo old sculpts to like make them look better? Or even like the battle box casters?
Yeah, there might be a couple different answers to that. I know my answer is when they need to look cooler, but I also think that maybe if there's an update to that faction or there's a new theme list. The only models like that I can think of that I did were the Satixus Raiders when the Satixus got their theme update or whatever it was. And we redid the Raiders, and we had a couple
all those
of
chains.
Yeah. And so that was actually something I was super excited about doing because it's one of those models that you feel like you come full circle because I had the old ones and I got to work on the new ones. I think there's just a time, a place. Sometimes we have something sitting around that we're like, well, if we need to slot something in, we can slot these new sculpts in. But I don't think there's any real, unless there's a theme force coming out for it or some kind of something that deals with it directly where it looks like there's a reason to redo it and a reason for people to buy another unit of it. Because once people have a unit of models and they painted them up and they've been using them for years, they may be less inclined to buy something new, even if it does look a lot better.
That's what New Blood's for.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
So speaking of New Blood, I know that we have a couple of new players that are coming in, and they're really excited to hear about all these new models. And even I find like some like players that have taken a break for 4 or 5 years, they're trying to get back into it and asking, what's happening because they're hearing all the buzz. Can we ask you a couple of questions about what's going on with, I guess, the current things that you're working on that Privateer Press is starting to put out?
You can absolutely ask me questions. Whether you get a good straight answer, that's to be determined.
So we saw with the new Signar and Kador spoilers with the 80mm base models, what looks like one's kind of a solo riding on a beast, and then you have some vehicles and stuff like that. What kind of design spaces this open up for with these 80 millimeter? I guess they're solos. Is that what they are? Do we know?
The only other time I saw 80 millimeter bases, I think, was Warcaster, right? Because they had the vehicles in there as well.
So we've talked about doing 80 millimeter bases for years and years and years. Like even from my early days of joining Privateer, Bron and I would talk about how cool it would be to have that in between base, that in between the 50 and the 120. Whether it was for jacks or larger beasts or just something more imposing, but not as huge as a Colossal. And so I think it definitely opens up a lot of room. I would love to see some beasts and some warjacks on 80 millimeter bases that fill up those bases. So I'm hopeful. I've only seen, I may have seen more than what you've seen, but the Orgoth model looks fantastic on 80 millimeter. And I know there may be other stuff like that coming. So I think 80 millimeter opens up a lot of opportunity and a lot of design space. I know you guys love that word.
It totally makes sense for like an in-between jack too. Because you look at something like the Behemoth or even like Mulg, and they kind of just envelop that 50 millimeter base and just overhang like a lot. It's just like this was made to be a big imposing piece that you just couldn't get any. There's no larger base size in the game for it.
Yeah, because it feels like Colossals. There are times on the table where I feel like a Colossal takes up a little too much space, but I want something bigger than 50 mil.
Okay, and then for fluff-wise, I believe the Orgoth invasion happened 5 years right after the Infernal invasion. I think that's like the timeline that I'm seeing, and we see that Khador has this tank and Signar has like this beefier tech. Like, is the design space for these new models that 5 years have gone by? We have 5 years of technology forward, and that's influencing the design of these models for the War Machine factions.
I don't know exact timelines, but I can assure you that as time goes by, the technology does get a little bit better. So yes, let's go with time has influenced the design on these the Storm Legion and the Orgoth and whatever else we've shown that I don't want to say anything.
Okay, that's fine. And then what about for hordes? And because like I know it's been very much of a primal look. This question actually comes from one of our local players with designing stuff, and we're doing this technology with hordes as well. How do you stay true to the aesthetics of that faction that made it like look the way they did? Like I think like the Blackclads, or what is it? What are they called? The Praetorians for Scorn.
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Same within the faction and trying to keep that look, especially over all the years and with different creative people involved. That's where a guy like Ron or a guy like Matt comes in, and they keep the art people focused on what defines that faction. So even going into the future with factions, there's still an aesthetic that we try to stick to. Even if it's a new one, we define that early on and try to make sure that you know what faction you're looking at. Occasionally, there'll be something that doesn't make sense or may not fit, and there may or may not be a reason for that. But in the current day and age, we try to stay pretty close to what the expected aesthetic is for that faction.
All right, so of the new stuff that's coming out, what's your favorite model that you've worked on that hasn't been released yet?
Well, the new stuff all looks really great, but the new stuff that I'm working on, nobody's seen anything of. There's no art, there's no models, and I can tell you I have a lot of them on my desk that I'm working on right now. So I'm super excited about sharing that and showing what I've been working on. I can tell you that one of the models that I finished up today, I can't tell you the faction or anything like that, but I think it could be some of my best work, maybe my best work. I love the way this model has turned out.
Oh my gosh.
Everyone's very excited for the future right now. We're all looking towards hopefully the fall sometime, but we'll see how it goes.
Well, I think the thing we keep on hearing is Gen Con, am I right?
I don't know the release schedule. That's not my department. But I can tell you that as these new models come out, like as Orgoth and Storm Legion, I am dying to get my hands on those models and get them on the table.
I think Paul's planning on buying the entire faction.
I plan on getting Orgoth, yeah.
You and me both. I had them at Adepticon. They gave me the case to keep in my room, and I'm like, you sure you want to do this? Because I want these models really bad.
Doug, that was a lot of fun stuff to go and talk about, and really, really appreciate your time coming on to Tried and True. And this is getting us to the end of the interview, and we want to know if you had any closing remarks or anything else you wanted to share.
Yeah, actually, I have a closing remark, and that is I'm sure I'm going to talk to you real soon, because you're going to want to talk a lot very soon.
Oh my god, I'm so excited.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Well, with that, Doug, thank you again for coming on to Tried and True. I'm hoping that people really enjoyed listening to you and your insight on the process of making these 3D models. I think a lot of us think that it's just like hey, the model gets made and you call it a day. And it was just it's so enlightening to be able to see all the little tiny steps and all the little, just the back and forth communication between making all these things.
Yeah, there's a lot to it, and I'm always happy to share, and I appreciate you guys having me on. I've been listening to your podcast. In fact, I'm in the middle of your interview with Lauren, and I always like to hear what Lauren's up to. One of my favorite people to catch up with at conventions, which, speaking of conventions, I hope that some of your listeners will come by the Privateer booth at Gen Con and say hello and BS with me for a little bit.
And with that, that's going to go ahead and conclude this episode of Tried and True. On the next episode, we have one more guest coming on, and he's going to go ahead and talk about what he does, and that will conclude our deep dive into Privateer Press. So from all of us here in Delaware, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode. See you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.